are doing well. Again, my name is Manuel Criollo, and I work at Forward Change, and I also had, I've worked really hard in being part of the team that's built Dignity in Schools Campaign California. And really, this is an internal an internal kind of slide deck that we've been working on. And it's a lot about us trying to really respond to the moment and also trying to find our own footing on issues about state policy, state legislation. How do we think about our own work? I don't have a lot of time to talk about what DSC California is. What I will say that it's almost a 9-year project that was started by some of the important groups that have helped kind of spark the school to prison pipeline work here in California. Groups like Cadre, groups like Black Organizing Project, groups like YJC, Milpa, GSAND, some of the key groups, Coleman Advocates, and then within that, then there's also been sort of regional work, which I know some of y'all are tied. Like I know YJC was part of Dignity in Schools California, Dignity in Schools campaign Los Angeles when it first started, almost now almost 12 years. And we came, just to be honest, we got together like most things now, unfortunately, in the movement, is that a funder says, "Oh man, we fucked up. We should have had groups on the ground coming together, especially when it comes to issues around school discipline or issues around state reform, because often they're not, the groups on the ground are not the ones that are often are not the ones that are being funded, are often sort of the second sort of fiddle to the bigger conversation that's happening at a state legislation level. Even though in some ways the work on the ground in Los Angeles, in the Bay, in San Bernardino, in the San Joaquin Valley, in Sacramento, we're really leading the way on a lot of these issues, challenging the many ways that young people and their families were being treated by school, being pushed out by schools, and moving toward this kind of pre-prison training that has come to be what we know as education. So in many ways, this experience has been a very one where we are constantly revolving who we are. So I call this peace, policy, politics, and power. And just I'd like to first start just like, let's demystify some of these words, right? We're all involved in one form of policy at the local level, at the state, or the federal level. And so there's not even like the weight of one versus the other one. It's just about the scale. And it's all about, what's the balance of forces that are really important. And obviously also policy, if we think about the word itself, right? We all have also our own policies, individual policies, organizational policies. In other words, what we conjure, what we consider, how we implement, how do we enforce our own sense of who we are, or the kind of organization we want to build. Those are built, the type of policies that we have about our workforce, the kind of policies of how we're going to treat each other as comrades, right? These are all issues about the policies of our work in relationship to other organizations. These are constantly ways that we are always doing this kind of work. And one of the people who when I was trying to think about this piece and we were trying to piece this together around how do we think about these issues, I always used to remember an elder told me that Huey Newton always said that power is the power to make somebody do something they don't want to do. And actually, I've been trying to look for that damn quote. If anybody has that quote, has access to that specific quote, that would be awesome. I've been reading it, can never find it. So maybe that elder kind of, was condensing the idea, or maybe, was combining a set of ideas that Huey Newton says. But, I like to go to this quote here that says, to us, power is first of all, the ability to define phenomena, and secondly, the ability to make this phenomena in a desired manner. So this is part of a bigger quote And it says, when we coined the expression "all power to people," we had in mind emphasizing the word power, but we recognize that the will to power is the basic drive of man. But it's incorrect to seek power over people. We've been subject to the dehumanizing power of exploitation and racism for hundreds of years. What we seek, however, is not power over people, but the power to control our own destiny. For us, the true definition of power is not in the terms of how many people you can control. To us, power is, first of all, the ability to define phenomena, and secondly, the ability to make this phenomena act in a desired manner. And this is the closest I could think of what this elder was trying to tell me, that power is about making somebody doing something they don't want to do. And that's how this idea, and for us, at DSC over the last 3 or 4 years, we've been trying to think about how do we even define this phenomena called power? And then once we defined it, what is going to be the path for us to allow us to consider how we're reaching power? So now I'm going back to these words, right? Politics, right? Politics, of course, when we think about the definition itself, in a kind of the definition on the dictionary, it says the management of governance, administrative, and control of internal and external affairs. So that's one way to think about how, what the actual definition of politics is also. But I also think because, this is in relationship to conversations about what's our relationship to power, what's our relationship to politics as they are in this country and in the state, or in our local kind of communities. It's important to also think that politics is also shaped by the system we live in. And then obviously in this system that we're talking about, it's a racist system, it's a colonial system, it's a capitalist system, it's a patriarchal system, it's an imperialist system. That means that these are all interwoven. They're not in competition with each other. They're all here because they can sustain themselves, right? Through having this very complex kind of systems of oppression is how they maintain power, because that's how they buy us out. That's how they oppress us. That is how sometimes we are able to have enough power to actually win concessions from them. This is sometimes the ways that they placate our movements. But in the reality is that this is all shaped by the system that we live in. And it's important for us, if we are going to define power, we also have to define then the system itself that we're living in. The third thing is policy, right? Policy, as I said earlier, right? We all have policies. It could be about policies of who you date, policies of who you don't date, policies about, what kind of car you want to drive, or policies are also, of course, in many ways, the policies that the government itself or the different institutions that are that provide services or that provide a particular function for the system is always constantly doing. So when you look at for the definition of policy, right? Policy is a course or principle of action adopted or proposed by a government, a party, a business, or individual. I have this famous picture. There's a first picture of the first school police officers at Jordan High School right after the 1965 rebellion in Los Angeles in Watts. Of course, Jordan was right at the heart of where the rebellion happened in 1965. And of course, what did the system do in response to that movement was to actually, of course, begin this system of mass incarceration and policing. And the first idea was to actually LA Unified School District put the first police in schools. LAPD and LA Sheriffs had programs to put police in schools, right? All in the name of community relations, all in the name of teaching. LAPD had a program called Youth and the Government, which was all about sort of counterinsurgency, to teach young people the right way to protest, the right way to follow the law, right? So these were policies in response to something, right? And of course, in most of our concepts, especially for dignity in schools, when we think a lot about policies, it's often in the context of us talking about reform, right? It comes through court case decisions, legislative laws, bills, school or police kind of enforcement mechanisms, mechanisms of how you're going to enforce the law or interpret the law, or, of course, voting that comes through policy. And for us, one of the first things that we thought about how we're going to think about power more than like power of are we winning something? Are we winning a particular reform? Are we particularly power? Is it that we're able enough are powerful enough to pass an actual like law? We thought actually that for us, power was first to prioritize movement building. That we wanted to prioritize power through leadership building. We wanted to build power through looking at a bottom-up, process. Not because we don't think that we need changes or that changes are necessary, but we felt that, especially in the context of the work around school to prison pipeline work, was that we had important breakthroughs that were happening in Los Angeles and in Oakland, in areas that most people assume, well, oh, that's Oakland and LA, that's passes. I always think, in fact, yeah, we could consider them to be a more less complicated, and particularly could have a set of shared values at times with certain elected officials. But the reality actually that even those processes took almost 10 years for most groups to win what they were winning in those areas, and that in fact came with massive set of compromises, right? Massive set of struggles to force people to do it. And that in fact, at least in the context of the school to prison pipeline work, is that the police still control the narrative, still control the concept of how the reform was going to be implemented, right? It wasn't that just, it was a better place, a more liberal place, but in fact, we felt that we needed to build a bottom-up process, especially when we consider places like the San Joaquin Valley or the Central Coast or the area in the Inland Valley, right? Areas that historically, in some ways, still have very explicit right-wing forces. In fact, much of their economy is sustained through, sort of a prison economies. And so we felt that for us to really win power, we really had to win in these local areas first as a way to sort of measure our power and sustain our power. Power for us was preparing our troops. Power for us was to win the terrain, as I said, at the local level, to expand people's consciousness, and to win it really over our communities, right? Was for us what we were going to consider power. And so it made us think also about, well, how do we think about this concept of policy and policy recommendations, and how we envision the kind of reforms or revolutionary reforms that we sort of perceive, right? And so we had to think about, well, what do we value and what do they value? And I know this is sort of a kind of a sharp sort of discussion, and that's not to say I'm poo-pooing on great lawyers and great policy advocates, and for sure I am poo-pooing on politicians, but it is important for us to think about, when we think about policy, right? In the way that we think about it is in particular, and I can only think about my own work either at the local level or even the attempted work that we've done at a statewide level or even at a federal level, right? Often when we think about the types of reforms and sort of legislative fixes and bills that we're thinking about it, we often think about it in this concepts of policy that we kind of understand the parameters of them. Policy often meant that it was very pragmatic. In other words, can it pass? What's the practicality of it? How much opposition are we gonna? Is it really going against the prevailing order, right? Sort of how do we sustain and win sort of the alliance that we need to build? Ordered for us, meant ordered within the structures of the government. In other words, we're gonna try to fix things, but not shake up things, right? At times. At times, and again, this is not in the context of the work that y'all have done, that has not been the case, because you guys have been pushing, the highest set of demand, which is to actually close a whole infrastructure, which of course has been almost 25, 30 years in the making. But often, at least in the work that we were seeing in the school to prison work, was always trying to push kind of the lowest common denominator. What's that kind of low hanging fruit that we can try to win, right? It's always about incremental improvements. It often came with a lot of set of compromises, and not because we think compromise is a bad word, but compromise also meant that our relationship to compromise is also about what's our our positionality to power itself, right? And that in some ways it's that kind of yearly routine, like, all right, hey, November's coming up. Let's start weedy about what we want to do, what we're thinking about the next year. We know it has to be in by February. We often know that by May, the committee meetings go. If it passes that time, then we got to go into move it to the state Senate side or the state assembly side. And then by August, we got to hope and struggle and find a sort of a collective process to win over the final vote or to avoid a veto for the governor, right? So when we were trying to think about our own sense of this, right, of if this is the kind of the way that it's often kind of considered, right, how do we think about it in a different way? And especially as we're speaking to our other allies, again, because in many ways, this is about us trying to discuss this with our other allies, especially lawyers, especially policy advocates, right, is to say that for us, what we want to value is the process, the practice. How does this fight look like? Is it being fought in our own, with what we imagine what was necessary to win it, right? It's also about what's the actual organizing process that we're trying to win this with, right? And what level of organization are we going to measure ourselves? In other words, were we stronger after this fight? Did we win new people in this fight? Did the people who we imagine would fall in line have been falling in line? That's really important for us, right? The third for us, it's about long-term change, right? Leadership. How do we build the leadership capacity of our folks, So for us, again, if we thought about how do we think about power, we felt that it's important for us to think about what's our ability to actually build the leadership of folks on the ground, in those daily practices, and not view it just, again, this kind of February to April, August kind of cycle, but what is our cycle of like long-term sort of leadership development that's happening, right? Also, like for us, it's about, the ideology of what kind of ideas we're trying to bring to the community. What are we hearing from the communities that's also transforming us about the ideas and what we can really imagine is necessary to change the system? How do we think about a process that actually is community-led, right? That in fact, often, at least in our experience with a lot of state, legislation, is that, somebody's already opposing something, so we're going to have to change that word from shall to should or would or could. And, you often have like, and you have, 2 hours to make a change to this kind of level of change, right? And so it's often very hard if we really want to build in that kind of community process of ownership of the process itself. This process, at least on a state kind of bill legislative process, doesn't allow us for that, because that's not what it's meant for. It's a different process, right? And then lastly, it's kind of like yields transformation, that we know that it's going to yield like a sort of transformational impact on the ground, and so that's how we kind of thought about, and when we think about if we are going to do and engage in policy, right, how can we best incorporate a lot of these kind of ideas? Obviously, these are running themes for most community organizations, most advocacy groups, I would say, most organizing groups, most groups on the ground, right? Most grassroots groups that's at the center of what we're often trying to at least consider when we're actually moving, right? So, so for us, we wanted to sort of like think about it, our movement building approach is really what we've sort of dedicated. So we didn't decide that we wanted to do work around the state because we felt that if we had to be really honest to ourselves, we weren't that strong, right? We wanted to kind of build a movement building process that we could judge that, hey, if we've defined what power can be, have we really gotten to that point of power, right? Our level of influence, our ability to kind of like measure our sort of work through our organizational kind of capacity, the leadership, the kind of consciousness that would take that to do that, right? So to be honest, for the last 6 to 7 years, we've been pretty stealth, has been doing a lot of peer-to-peer exchanges to learn from people on the ground, right? to learn from what is really working in Oakland, what is really working in San Bernardino, how are organizations that organize particular communities, like sort of black organizing project, what have they done, how do they build power, what are the contradictions that they run into, right? So a lot of it's been kind of a lot of peer-to-peer exchange. A lot of it's what we call now translocal organizing models. In other words, we think that maybe sometimes the way to transform the debate is not necessarily a state law, but can we win the most an impactful set of policies, or a set of, like, transformative set of demands that are won by one city, right? And so in other words, we all sort of jump and support one city or one local struggle to actually win, a demand that's actually going to transform and change the terms of debate for us, right? For us, that meant a lot of the work that we supported the Black Organizing Project in their work to actually get rid of the school police department at Oakland, right? That's not our victory, but we definitely thought it was part of our strategy, right? That we were going to do everything. And obviously, because BOP is one of our main leaders of our organization, was that we felt that if we could win that, if that victory is won by BOP, that it will it will change the terms of debates for everybody in the state. And that is obviously, on one hand, that meant that almost for 3 years, that's what we've done a lot. We've done solidarity pledges. We've done solidarity work from all over the state, calling on different local reps to actually support the BOP campaign. It's been trying to organize, our own folks to understand who can we have any impact in those areas to help and support the work of BOP in that, and to ultimately uplift the work that BOP has done, because we knew that when the moment that they were going to win, it also would meant that there was going to be many or other forms and people who were going to claim that victory. But we knew that they had been doing that work for almost 10 years, right? And more importantly, right, what were some of the lessons in that work that they were doing, right? And how to maximize that victory for the state. So we put a lot of that kind of translocal ability for us to measure that as an important moment of victory, right? And then in terms of consciousness for us, DSC California is not, a monolithic group. We come out of different traditions. Some organized parents, some organized youth groups. Some of them, most of the organizations have been sort of grassroots community organizations, but some do have origins as mainly kind of policy forms, right? Or historically been policy forms, or have been more kind of like youth development forms, not necessarily youth organizing forms, right? And so for us, is also in that kind of period of building power, was to understand building our own consciousness. And that often meant that sometimes, even though our North Star was to eliminate police from schools, that didn't mean that everybody in the coalition itself was there yet, but there was an openness to share the idea that this is possible, right? And that's the actual vision and bravery that we need to provide that possibility of how we build it. And we allow that for both that kind of space of like expansive thinking, and yet in some ways allow the local level to kind of marinate how they're going to approach this work in their local level. But we're also uplifting our own consciousness in that process, right? Because obviously in a local community, there's going to be a set of dynamics that are going to either diminish your possibilities, are going to support you on your think. And so again, a lot of our power building for the last 6 or 7 years has been this process. And this is not, I'm not talking smack about anybody else, but this is in relationship to other forms, right? Like fixed school discipline, we've been important allies in this struggle for a long time. And obviously the Men and Boys of Color Alliance, right? From the beginning, from our own relationship to a lot of state legislation, it's been all is on one hand, a lot of the state bills that we see on, especially in the beginning, we're talking about now 8-9 years ago, right? Was often trends that started in the local level. So for example, in Los Angeles, it was getting rid of willful defiance suspensions. It was about, kind of restricting the way that truancy and tardy absences in schools was impacting family and young people. It was about, getting rid of, like, really restraining expulsions and suspensions for young people. It was really challenging police in schools, right? And so a lot of that was following the trend from the local level. But obviously, then when you go try to implement at a state level, this process begins again, where we have to find first a sponsor that's actually going to be open to actually sponsor it and is clear enough about what it's going to be. But of course, given that we're not, in some kind of decolonial, anti-patriarchal socialist state, we're in a, capitalist country and state, one of the richest states in the country, that has been built out of prisons and police, has been the order for the last 40 years. We have usually liberal lawmakers who have a lot of contrasting interests and allegiances. So for us, even the bills that we would be able to help kind of write and imagine came with a lot of compromises, a lot of set of parameters that we didn't feel was important for us. So when the bill was drafted, right, again, the kind of the state order that we live in and the sort of privatizing, pro-prison, pro-police kind of state that we're in, our options are very limited, and the political efficiencies that are in that kind of within that realm also don't allow us the possibilities to do that, right? So in many ways, this is how we relate to this. Doesn't mean that this always happened, but for us on the ground, we often felt like we were kind of the critical cheerleaders. In other words, there was great policy groups that said like, oh man, we're getting a great sponsor to support this bill. But often, as local groups, what we were asked is, can you come up? Well, obviously this is a little bit pre-COVID and pre the kind of apocalyptic period we're in right now. But go up to Sacramento, give your 2-minute speech about why this is important. Let's bring a parent, let's bring a student who can really share their testimony and tell their story. And I would say we're kind of critical cheerleaders often. That's how I felt for us, right? Doesn't mean for others, but for in our sector of our work, that's what we often felt like, right? And often bills were never discussed about, well, what's going to happen once it passes? What's the ramifications once it passes? How are we going to actually implement this? Because the first half of the battle is, can we even win it? And then the second half of the battle is, how are we going to actually implement it? How are we going to educate people about that this bill passed? Again, because we weren't the ones that were often in the leadership of these kind of policy recommendations. We were often just signees to it. We were often kind of consulted by it, right? So there was none of that kind of grassroots sense of ownership of the victory itself, right? And so, so how do we really maximize and how are we often actually not even assessing what's the power of this bill or not, right? How do we maximize a bill? What are the new shifts that are happening? What's going to happen if it passes, right? What are the kind of what can we already pre-configure as we're kind of coming up with this? What are going to be the ramifications for it? How it's going to impact people on one sense, when in another community it's another, right? And so, and obviously, and I always say that none of the things that we do, we don't fully always comprehend what's going to be the impact on the ground, right? And so for us, again, the way we were thinking about how to relate to this was, again, this was not for us the way to build power, because, and that doesn't mean that it's shade on any other form or shade on the folks who kind of do that a lot of the work. But to be honest, a lot of this has been the conversation we've had with organizations that do a lot of great work around, kind of state legislative process. And it's been a lot about this kind of set of conversation, right? That if we really are in the lead, in other words, if the local communities really are at the lead, right? Maybe what we need to do is not pass a bill for 1 year. Why don't we consider what we've already passed? What has been the possibility of not us being able to implement it, right? And so a lot of that's how we kind of approach this question. Again, I just want to, for us, how do we think about this bottom-up approach? it's for us is it's not just kind of like a principle. It's also about how we it's how we really think of this as a benchmark of power and influence, right? In other words, the stronger we're unified, the stronger we're struggling with each other about these kind of questions about power, about policies, about the politics, what the problems that we're confronting, right? For us, what's the power? What's even in some ways our own weaknesses on the ground, right? How our organizing isn't going that well, right? A lot of these are the kind of questions that we've been trying to ask ourselves, right? And as a way to really try to begin to really understand how we can measure what is power and influence. We really think that it's important that we look at the conditions of something. That doesn't mean we're not gonna ever pass a state bill, or we're never gonna be in that realm. But for us, is where's our strength? What can we really leverage? What leverage is going to be needed to do it, and how are we going to scale up, right? And sort of still maintain both our approach and our principle to it, but more importantly, like how are we really reading the conditions and not just be in that cycle of like, whoa, November's coming and let's kind of like start thinking about that new cycle, right? We want to be really intentional about then why if this path, why this path, right? And to be honest, for us, like on one level, we're really kind of prioritizing this movement building, really preparing our troops, right? And as I said earlier, right, can we win local terrain, right? And again, in the example of both in Oakland, right, what we saw with the recent kind of uprising with the George Floyd flashpoint that's happening at this moment, right? And the important work that Bob, and I know a lot of key organizations here today were key supporters of that victory. So it's not just Bob's victory, but it is their leadership that provided that leadership, that process, right? But it opened up the path for places like Fresno, it opened the path for Sacramento, it opened the path for Los Angeles. Now, it doesn't mean that those groups aren't doing work on the ground, but it kind of broke open the possibility, right? By having that kind of winning that terrain at the local level. I just want to say that, again, I'll just cut this short. For us, a lot of the things that why we're kind of been in this process has been, again, the shifting terrains, right? Because at one moment, a lot of this school to prison work was really popping, but a lot of things have changed, right? There's been Trump. There's this kind of so-called super Democratic majority in California that I know most of y'all out of your own experience, it also had a lot of set of limits when you think about that so-called super Democratic majority, right? There's been a lot of prison reforms, right? Yet a lot of that has been sort of moved toward local jail expansion, right? And a lot of the schoolwork, a lot of it was about LCFF and a lot of the struggles about resources. Here you got more so-called equity resources for schools, but what was that equity resource going into is actually more police in schools, right? We're also obviously very cognizant of the kind of big struggle that's going to happen around the Prop 13 reform, right? And of course, the new reaction against a lot of that school discipline work is what kind of kept us. So, again, maybe this is what we can end with here is, things that we've been trying to think about, how do we kind of think about power, right? And it's many different aspects of it, right? One is like, what is power, right? What do we really consider power? And again, for us, it's been a lot about having those kind of conversations to even understand ourselves, because it's not like, even though we're a strong unified knit and we found ourselves for a particular reason, we also come out of different traditions. And so how do we really think about this question about power? For us, it's also like, what do we see as the real problem? Not just about the issue that we care about or that one reform that we definitely think is needed, but what's really behind. What's the root issue of that reform? What's the root issue of the problem that we're confronting, right? What's the pulse of resistance? Are we even good? Are we even doing well? Our organizing, is it doing well? Is the leadership, is the capacity of the community prepared to have this fight? Is this central to what they consider important things, right? What's needed, right? What are the hardships and the contradictions that are going on the ground? what's our own, you know, this is for ourselves, what's our own policies about supporting or opposing policies, right? Which I'll speak for ourselves, right? We didn't have those kind of conversations. We had like our own sort of internal organizational level, or a lot of us, to be honest, we just sign on a bill. Yeah, like that sounds good, without really thinking about why do we support one or why do we oppose it, right? And then again, for us, power is going to be how do we think about it, you know, broader freedom dreams? Is that what we're trying to reach as a collective, right? What is how do we plan to build power? You know, for in the case of Dignity in Schools campaign was to put a lot of actual resources and actual money into areas like Central Valley, Central Coast, the Inland Valley, right? Because for us, you know, again, if we were thinking about moving toward a state kind of level, it was going to be important for us to have that struggle in that fight. And sorry, got get distracted. And then lastly, you know, how are we going to take sort of opportunities, respond to new opportunities, crisis, and new horizon? And in fact, the funny thing, this is what we were saying, you know, a year ago, and obviously so much has changed now, right? Again, for us, you know, it's been about how we do now need to respond to actual state processes that are either going to help, you know, push us forward, or actually is going to also have impacts on the ground in some ways or another, you know. So with that, I'm going to stop there. I know I'm already sort of pushing the boundaries of our time, but I'm hoping that this is helpful for folks about our own process, you know, about how we're thinking about these questions. And again, in no ways have we resolved these. In some ways, we're still in this last kind of slide right now about how are we defining these moments. The only thing we can sort of assess is that for us, again, we've chosen a different path of right. And yet, I think because we've chosen that path, we feel like hopefully, right, it is preparing us for the next terrain that's going to come.